And getting back on track. Our next presenter is Mason Cooley. Mason received his BFA and MFA from Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. He's taught extensively throughout his career, including lots of different courses at our settlement school and craft school programs here in Southern Appalachia. He's got over 15 years of teaching college-level studio art and design courses in various public and private universities. We're really excited to have him here today to talk about his work building and working with bamboo as a material to build bicycles. So if everyone could, welcome Mason Cooley to the podium.
So I've been teaching art and design over the course of about 20 years, and in my studio I do custom furniture. But one of the side projects I've had over the years is to do these community workshops on building bamboo bicycles. So this is an example. This is actually the same bike that I ride. The idea here is to sell the bamboo bike frames. It's to teach people how to build them with a fairly inexpensive jig setup. So sometimes I do it with schools and sometimes I do it through my own studio. What I'm going to do, and again, probably go through some of these pictures pretty quickly, but it sort of fits the style and form of my talk. I'm going to talk about the bamboo bike workshop, but I'm also going to use it as a way to expand, to think about a lot of things that might not come to one's mind immediately when you think about using bamboo and building bicycle frames. A lot of this content is information that I've used in my teaching over the years. So bamboo is a grass. It grows very quickly, as I'm sure most of you know. The strength-weight ratio exceeds steel. So as far as its internal strength as a natural material, it's quite strong. It has a lot of compression strength and a lot of tensile strength. So for using it the way I am, it's sort of perfect. I don't really have to do anything to it other than cure it. We go ahead and remove the nodes, which are those chambers you see as they kind of go along the bamboo tube. So each one of those pieces of bamboo is hollow, but other than that, once it's cured, it's ready to be used for a bamboo bicycle frame. Most people ask me, do you do this because it's lightweight? And no. Lightweight, believe it or not, isn't really the most important factor to a bicycle frame. So what's more important is actually how it feels when you're riding it, how it handles, and the type of terrain you can go over with the bicycle. And I would say bamboo, similar to steel actually, bamboo is a very compliant material for going out into the mountains, through the forests, on the gravel roads, paved and unpaved. It's a really great adventure bike. I would not think about it as a race bike, let's say. So this is a very utilitarian style bicycle, which is why I wanted to do the bamboo bike workshops in the first place. What I'm going to end with today is actually talking about nanocellulose. So one of the things I've been doing with the University of Maine is getting nanocellulose sent down to me to start using it as a biocomposite. And all nanocellulose is wood pulp. And it's been mechanically altered so that the slurry you get once it's dried is very strong, but it's 100% biodegradable. So the idea is that nanocellulose is going to eventually sort of replace a lot of the epoxy resins that we use, either in manufacturing, product packaging, or even in the food industry. So the nanocellulose that I have here in my bag, I could actually just eat that if I wanted to. There's nothing added to it. It's wood pulp. It's just been mechanically altered on the nanoscale. So all those wood fibers have been reoriented in a way to make it actually stronger than if it was just straight wood pulp. But a lot of artists and designers are starting to actually use this material to sort of replace materials that have an industrial heritage to them. So in my case, it would be trying to replace the epoxy resins. Bamboo is a rhizome, and this is going to be sort of the metaphor, the structure I'm going to use to talk about systems in general. And the images that I'm going to show once I give some examples of the bamboo bike and a few other bikes, I'm going to use this rhizome as kind of the structure I'm going to adhere to. So, this talk isn't linear. It's a very nonlinear talk. So what do I mean by system and network? These are basically the two concepts I want you to kind of keep in mind as I start showing you a lot of images, some that might make more metaphorical sense than literal sense in the talk. So when I'm thinking about a system, I'm just thinking about all the interconnections in one's environment. So it could be a physical, biological, psychological, or social system. And the way that system gets understood is actually thinking about how it's organized. And organization in a system is not static. It's constantly moving and evolving. So the interesting thing to me is, what are the different points, what are the different nodes in this rhizome that I can pay attention to as an artist and designer, and then use that both literally and metaphorically in what I teach and also what I make. And I really think the Bamboo Bike Workshop is an interesting example of that. So this pattern of organization is really what I'm going to be showing you today. So I'm going to be showing you some examples of fractals, some examples of what it might look like to look at a system from a visual point of view. But again, after I show some examples of the bicycle frames, that's where I'm going to try to make this broader connection to the environment. So again, two concepts here. One is self-organization, the other is emergence. All you need to remember about self-organization is that the idea is that whatever this form, whatever this structure is that we're looking at, if it's self-organized, it's coming from the bottom up. There's no laws or rules in place from the top down. So the interesting thing about self-organizing phenomena in the environment, and the most common example you'll read about are ant colonies. So the idea that an ant colony is self-organized simply means that the interactions of the ants lead to the conditions for the colony to arise, which is the emergent property, but none of those individual ants have anything to do with controlling or dictating how that colony behaves. So the colony kind of has a reality and an organization of its own, but it still relies on the interactions and relationships of those ants. And so neuroscientists will talk about the brain this way, the relationship to the mind, that somehow these neurons, as they interact, lead to conditions that create mindfulness. But we can't really define for sure what we mean by mindfulness, except to say that it seems to be an emergent property coming from those interactions of the neurons. So the only reason I'm sharing this with you is this is how my brain works. This is how I think about what I make, both as an artist and a designer, but also as a teacher. And the Bamboo Bike Workshop, over the years, as I've kind of incorporated it into my lifestyle, I've come to realize that all these things are kind of interrelated. So just a little brief overview on bamboo bikes. It's not a new material used in bicycle frames. One interesting thing about the history of bicycle frames is basically every design and every material has been tried and retried again. So one of the interesting things about bamboo is that in 1894, it was actually attempted to be used for a commercial purpose, where they're going to sell it as a product, but they had some challenges as far as how they joined the bamboo. So they eventually did not last very long as a material to be used in that way. Craig Calfee, who's the person I learned from in the 1990s, and I came into this in the 2000s, he's the one that kind of modernized the bamboo bicycle frame as we know it today. And I'll show you an interesting example of that in a minute. So this is not a bamboo bicycle frame. This is an early laminated wood bicycle frame. And again, it's interesting not only for its year, because the idea was that they were going to switch over to wood because they figured metal was going to need to be conserved during World War II, but it turns out they actually needed more wood than the metal. So one of the things that we sort of see here in this example is not only the lamination, but maybe the use of white oak. So white oak gets used to build ships because it's a very compliant material for steam bending. So even though this is 1942, the main thing we don't see in this frame is an actual seat tube. It's gone. So what that shows me is from the very beginning of bicycle design and invention, they're experimenting. So this is called a double triangle. This is a double triangle, but only virtual, because we actually are missing a part of that double triangle. But the double triangle is what gives that bicycle frame a lot of strength and resilience. Personally, one of the interesting things to me is, why did they run the lamination horizontally and not vertically? Nowadays we run the lamination vertically. It's going to have a lot less tendency to break in that direction. But it was ran this other direction in this design. So there's the double triangle. Whether you see a double triangle or not, it's always being used as a principle within the bicycle frame. And it's one of the reasons why I started thinking about Buckminster Fuller again, because it's this obsession with the triangle, the arch, right, as kind of a metaphor and actual structure that's both in things that humans make and also things that non-human things make, like I'll show later with termite mounds. But it's that arch, that triangle, that double triangle, and then it's the geodesic dome, which is a bunch of these double triangles, that really got me thinking about this pattern of organization. So again, that's my systems point of view that I kind of apply to a lot of this. Here's a bamboo bicycle frame that's not complete yet. So you can see the metal fixtures, so we can fit on all of our bicycle components. The lugged areas get covered over with something, and this is what I'm exploring with nanocellulose. So I'm trying to get away from epoxies, and I'm trying to use nanocellulose for the lugged areas. This is an example of using epoxy for the lugged area. This frame is similar to this one, whereas underneath that epoxy resin is a fiberglass epoxy resin. So again, another material that I'm eventually trying to move away from. This is the bicycle frame on the jig. And as I said, I'm trying to make this as accessible as possible. So most of these jig parts are just bought from the hardware store. There's nothing fancy going on here. The most important thing on the jig is that it's giving you a center line. So if you can kind of imagine the center line having to run exactly through the plane of the frame so that the bike goes down the road straight. That's the most important thing that we care about when we're working flat on the jig in this manner. But again, this is not the only way to do it. There's so many interesting ways to build a bicycle frame made of bamboo, or wood for that matter. That's another example of the lug. This is Craig Calfee's kind of invention. So again, we're thinking in kind of this holistic way. So I don't want you to think that the word craft and the word design are somehow in this dichotomy where the two histories don't overlap. They completely overlap. And I would say in the 21st century, craft and design now are so enmeshed with one another, partly through the technology and the internet, that it's a really exciting time period. I think it's a very different time period than in the early to mid 20th century. So this is sort of Craig's idea of an e-bike. So there's an electric motor on this thing, there's powered headlights on this thing, It's got bamboo spokes. It's got a bamboo, let's just call it like this little bridge area. So again, this is a double triangle, but it's distorted and weird. It's actually kind of similar to that 1942 design. He got rid of that seat post, but now he's sort of sitting on this little bridge of bamboo. So the tensile strength of that bamboo, it can flex, it can move without necessarily just giving way and breaking. So when you ride a bamboo bike, that's what you experience. You experience that dampening feel. You experience less of that road vibration. And I would say that this is kind of an experimental angle on using an old material. And for Craig, the lugged areas, those darker areas, that's all hemp that he uses with epoxy resin. So he's getting that kind of burl effect through that mechanical process of actually using epoxy resin and just a lot of sanding and shaping. So I used to teach this class called Beautiful Networks, and it's, the class that I would bring a lot of this content I'm going to go through very quickly in the middle of this talk right now. What I said a minute ago about not putting craft and design into separate camps. So we all know in the 20th century, design was coming out of an industrialized economy. Design was sort of striving for its own language. And it had a tendency to use craft as an example of what it didn't want to be. Whereas now, craft and design are actually like I said, they've sort of come full circle. And as an artist and designer, you're using the language of both, right? It's not an either or. It's a both and thing. So when I think about these systems and Buckminster Fuller, he had this sort of interesting way of looking at the environment as a verb, looking at the environment as something that's doing something. It's not sitting there as a container. It's not sitting there in a static manner. His geodesic domes, I think we're all familiar with, especially how popular they had become. He wasn't the inventor of this, but he definitely, in this country, led the movement in terms of making them, a more familiar form. When I look at these things, again, I'm looking at them for that arch, that triangle, that double triangle, the bicycle frame, the strength of the bicycle frame, the strength of the dome. The first exercise he did at Black Mountain College with his students during a summer session was to actually build an icosahedron. And that's essentially what you would build before you would do a full-fledged dome or spherical shape. And these are some pictures of them doing it over there off of Lake Eden. So, how many people have seen Powers of 10, this film? Yeah, from the 70s? Right. So, it's one of the things in art school, like we all were sort of exposed to it, just like we were exposed to Black Mountain College to a certain degree. But I started coming back to this because I'm thinking this is the way I'm thinking about the bamboo bike project, but also other things that I'm designing and building, is that if you're going to look at the environment holistically, then you're really going at every scale you can. And Powers of 10 is awesome because it's really starting with the very large, like the galaxy or universe, and going all the way down to the cellular level. And then it runs the film in reverse and goes back the other way. So for example, like right now, if I just wanted to speed all this up, this is all the stuff I got to show you in the next few minutes, right? So it's just kind of a interesting way to prime the brain a little bit. And for me in college, it reminded me of, believe it or not, like being a young person growing up in Southern California and thinking about Disneyland. So believe it or not, like Disneyland in my mind is probably the first time that I came across a system or structure that seemed larger than me, but that somehow I was still inside of it. So, and it was simulating worlds and experiences that weren't readily available in my ordinary life, but I would go there like every year because I lived like practically in the neighborhood, right? So one of the interesting ways I think to think about something like this is to look at these early drawings and photographs of it as having this kind of cellular structure. And I mean that metaphorically, and I also mean that more literally. So the information flow, the material flow, all the things that are actually happening to make this Disneyland a self-sustaining place is interesting to me from a cultural perspective, but also a material perspective. So there's mechanical automatons in Disneyland, as we all know, and then there's this idea of a cellular automata, right? Which is sort of the kind of fractal version of that mechanical automaton example. So if you go back, to the 18th century and you look at these old clockworks, and there are these dolls that you wind up, and they go through all these very naturalistic movements. Disneyland, because of its history and connection with World's Fairs, did a lot of terrible things, but it also sort of extended that mentality of that clockwork universe in through the 20th century as a form of entertainment. So this is a very early picture of it. The Matterhorn is not there yet. The freeway system over there on the right-hand corner, this is the world. This is the context in which this gets created. So again, the permeable membrane, the cellular structure, yes, it's a metaphor, but at the same time, it has some interesting problems about it, which is there's only one way in and out of this thing. We could go on and on about all the ways that it actually is structured to give you the illusion of a certain kind of experience, including changing the scale of Main Street as you walk down Main Street, and then you get to the end of Main Street and there's a castle. But for my purposes in this talk, it's really about looking at this thing from this sort of multi-dimensional point of view. So it's the kid in me, and it's also the adult in me wanting to be fooled by it, but also wanting to kind of see it as a lens onto the environment in which it's actually emerging out of. So one of the ways that I do this is to kind of think of another example like a hurricane. A hurricane is a literal steam engine. Could you do that with this Disneyland picture? I think you can. I think you can think of it as a literal cellular organization. You don't have to think about it as the corporation Disney necessarily. You can think about it from this bottom-up way, where the structure and the organization kind of gets animated from within, and then leads to different, patterns, basically. So autopoiesis, literally just, defining that as self-making, self-sustaining. The red spot on Jupiter is a good example of an autopoietic structure, but we can also see these things all around us all the time, at every scale. So if we're thinking about this pattern of organization, we're really thinking about the relationships between the different agents or parts. So again, that rhizome of the bamboo, the nodes that are growing out, it's a nonlinear system and structure. Gregory Bateson talks about it with the digits of your hands. It's not that important that we have 5. What's important is this, the space between the digits. So it's the connection between the fingers. It's the relationship between them. That's the pattern of organization, not necessarily that we've got 3, 4, or 5 of them, right? So there's a qualitative way to think about pattern, and then there's the quantitative way. So again, it's not just like a numerical issue, it's more of the connections between these actual agents or parts. So one of the easiest ways for me to visualize some of this And you can go online and actually download or do a web version of this, is to use what's called Conway's Game of Life. And all of these mathematics were originally done by hand, believe it or not, but with computers now you can run these interesting visual simulations. And this is an example of a pattern of organization where if I'm running it on the software, this is basically what I'm going to see. It's exponentially growing in every direction. And that all you're actually looking at here are squares on a grid. So there's a simple rule as to how these squares on the grid create a new square on the grid. And it's just a simple ratio between how many have to be alive as opposed to dead near each other. But it's that simple rule that actually creates, over time, exponentially, this really interesting kind of complicated pattern and organization of that information. So if I zoomed into this, all I would literally see are squares on a grid, but this overall pattern is irreducible to that. This starts to look like coral, it starts to look like slime mold, it starts to look like a city, it starts to look like rivers and streams, neurons of the brain. You know, there's all this pattern of organization that sort of comes into play depending on what examples you're using. So here's an actual image of slime mold. Some other fractal patterns you're all familiar with would be like these vegetation in plants, these branching systems. So again, we might be thinking of this in terms of like plant communication. We might be thinking of this in terms of the rhizome with the bamboo, but it's also us seeing these patterns of organization in relationship to, like I said, the environment, and kind of zooming out and thinking about how those folds and how those patterns develop. So this would be an example in Southern California of tract housing, which is kind of a scary image just because there's so much of this. But again, not to say that developers of these communities are thinking about how the brain gets folded and organized to fit in such a small space as the human skull, but they are inadvertently doing the same thing here. So it's the same pattern of organization, but it's a different physical material. So they're trying to fit as many houses into this little area between the mountains as possible, which means that they've all got to live on these kind of ridiculous little curved streets that really go nowhere. And so, you know, from an exiting point of view in a wildfire, it's a terrible design. But from the point of view, which is what human evolution was doing, to fit a lot of material into a small container like the human skull, that's a really clever solution to that problem. This is it zoomed out. So Disneyland is somewhere within this environment. That's what I mean about powers of 10. Like zooming out and you suddenly realize, oh, the cellular organization just keeps going and going and going, and that would be that infinite variation and that self-similarity that the fractal patterns are so good at illustrating to us. And again, these fractal patterns could be natural or cultural. It doesn't really matter at that point. So the brain is doing this with neuroplasticity and body maps. You know, your brain actually disproportionately has a view of your body, and it looks more like this, according to your actual physical sensations. So areas of your body that are more sensitive, like fingertips, your brain is actually thinking as though those things are like this big, as opposed to like this part of my body or the back of my knee that's not nearly as sensitive. So we would call that homunculus, you know, that the brain has this sort of image of the body that you yourself aren't really aware of, but the brain is able to extend the range of your body into the environment even to the extent that your shadow is actually accounted for in the body map. So when I get on a bicycle, this is what I'm thinking about, because I'm like, okay, the bicycle, I've been doing this for like most of my life. This thing is definitely an extension of my body, and neurologically, my brain has adapted to that. And I think we all know that. We all know that intuitively. We get in a friend's car and we're like, what? Like, I don't even know how far like the hood is now anymore. I don't understand like the size of this vehicle. But within a few minutes, the neuroplasticity kicks in, your brain starts adapting, and all of a sudden it's your car. It's not your friend's car. Now you're comfortable with it. Somewhat like using a tool or even a pencil. So going back to Buckminster Fuller and this idea of the triangle, the strength of the triangle is that arch. And so one of the areas that we see this happening that I find really fascinating is termite mounds. And it's almost like a proto version of 3D printing. And this is what I mean by kind of coming full circle now in the 21st century, where biomimicry, is not just something that we're thinking in an abstract way. Humans are finally realizing with the constraints of like what we've done to the climate, that in order for us to keep inventing things, we're probably going to have to do it the way it's already being done in nature. And so one of the interesting things about the termite mound is they literally use their own saliva. They make little balls. They put the balls on top of one another. Gravity starts pulling it down. It creates a little arch, and then they just keep doing that over and over and over, and they make tubes. And then that whole architecture, right, it becomes a somewhat self-supporting, self-sustaining system and structure. But it's the nature of that happening from the bottom up. That's the interesting part. There's no single termite in there that has the plans for this or is telling all the other termites exactly what to do. So this is an example of now 3D printing and architecture. So maybe we'll start using nanocellulose as building materials, which is one of the areas that they're trying to do experiments with in the industry. I really love the name of the machine, Crane Wasp. So again, I think of this metaphorically, and I also think of it literally. This can be a metaphor for the direction that we're going in, but it's also literally an example of using a more sustainable material, but in a way, and this goes back to Buckminster Fuller, but in a sustainable way as well in terms of the structure and system you're using to do that. You can't do it the old way with just a more sustainable material. It really has to be a new sort of process, and I do think the termite mound is literally, being filtered into this sort of example. And then in generative design using AI, Toyota did these seats recently. So again, rather than just relying on humans to come up with all the creativity, they'll put data points into the generative AI and say, like, we need a seat to do this. And then it self-generates all these possibilities. And believe it or not, you get designs that a human wouldn't have thought to do just based on how it looks, right? So whether or not they use this, we don't know. But as an experiment, it's interesting because the biomorphic quality really starts to come through, and it starts making you think about, well, maybe that is the lightest and strongest way to do it if the machine is sort of generating that possibility on its own as well. So again, I think of it holistically. I don't think that it as these things being sort of like in their own separate corners. So the nanocellulose that I'm getting is in the slurry form, and it has a lot of moisture in it, which is one of the challenges. But inside that nanocellulose are these fibrils, which again is another network, and that's where the strength of this material comes from. So again, they're not adding chemicals and additives to the wood pulp. they're just on a nanoscale reorienting those fibers to make it have properties it wouldn't ordinarily have, and most of the time it's just additional strength. So here it is in my studio. These are some examples I brought with me today. I've been adding polyway to it as well as tight bond wood glue, both in terms of giving it some water repulsion, but also in terms of allowing it to stick better to different surfaces. Polyway is a wood finish that I use that uses whey protein from cheese makers. So again, it's not a petroleum-based polyurethane. It's a polyurethane that's based on whey protein, and this is an example of the polyway that's already been mixed into the nanocellulose slurry. It goes on very thick. You're kind of thinking to yourself, like, what am I doing? And then a couple days later, it self-levels out to a very nice thin film. This hasn't been sanded at all. It actually follows the curve, the radius very well. This is over fiberglass. Eventually, I would like to get rid of the fiberglass. But it's a really interesting, weird material that it has this ability to go from like shape-shifting from one sort of one quality to another. So again, I'm applying it to this part here. It's all goopy and weird. And then it starts to dry and become somewhat translucent. And then it hardens. And now it's just like a coating over that part. So again, this is a picture of it applied at the beginning of the process. So this is all new to me, but I will say, as far as what I've experienced so far with the material, it's interesting to work with a material that is on its own going from such a thick state to a very thin film, but all on its own. Like, I don't have really anything to do with that. I just let it dry, and that's kind of what it wants to do on its own in that way. And so I think there's a lot of potential in that. I don't know exactly what, but it's interesting to me. This is it dried, and you can look at these in person and you can kind of feel the material. Once it's dried, it has a very plastic feel to it. So you don't necessarily experience it as wood or wood pulp. You experience it, especially if you're adding maybe the polyway to it, you experience it more as a kind of thin plastic material. So one of the things I want to do this coming year is incorporate the mycelium into it and some other fibrous material like hemp, and get rid of the fiberglass matrix and see if I can do it all with these biocomposites. And I really think, industry is going to go that way. I don't know if they'll start making bicycles with biocomposites, because the bike industry is kind of backwards in a lot of ways. But once somebody figures it out and it actually is a better solution, then I do think it's going to probably be a more familiar material in different products that you'll come across out there.
Does it bind well to ceramics?
What's that?
Does it bind well to ceramics?
I don't know, but I do know people up at the University of Maine, other artists, who are using it in that way. So it is one of these kind of wonder materials as far as, you can bake it. You can apply heat to it. You could mix it in as an additive to the clay. So the challenge with nanocellulose is the amount of, it's very hydrophilic, so the amount of water it likes to retain. So industry's having a hard time, I think, trying to figure that one out. But once that water gets removed, then, like I said, it's a very thin, strong film. But yeah, I would say ceramics would be a great area to experiment with it in. And if you want any of this stuff, you can contact me and I can give you a small, they sent me 5 gallons of it for free, which is great because the idea is for me just to kind of make it available to different artists and designers. So if you do want a small amount of it to experiment with, just, contact me. And that's it for my talk.